Good morning, class. We are going to focus on ELA, Module 3, Unit 1, Lesson 1. So what are we learning and doing for today? Well, we're going to restart our new topic. Today we're going to reread Chapter 1 of Peter Pan. At the end, you will recount the chapter. Recount is in yellow. It's highlighted. Wonder why. Let's look at our learning targets. Learning target number 1. I can explain how an illustration contributes to the text. Let's unpack that learning target. I underline illustration. Remember, illustration is another way to say picture. So we were looking at the author's picture and how it contributes to the text or how it adds to the text. The picture is really important, and we're going to find that out a little bit later on. So that's your learning target 1. I can explain how an illustration or picture adds or contributes to the text. Learning target number 2. I can recount Chapter 1 of Peter Pan. Man, there's that word recount again. It must be really important if we've seen it twice. Essentially, it is retell. So I can retell Chapter 1 of Peter Pan. Chapter 1, Famous Last Words. I'm going to go through and read Chapter 1 of Peter Pan. You will see the words on the screen. You are more than welcome to read with me or listen to me as I read. Famous last words. All children grow up. All except one. Wendy learned this when she was playing in the garden one day at the age of 2. She brought her mother a flower, and Mrs. Darling hugged her and said, "Oh, why can't you stay like this forever and ever?" Don't judge my accents that I'm going to be having in here. Before that day, Wendy didn't realize she wouldn't stay the same. Wendy had 2 younger brothers, John and Michael. They were growing too. Mrs. Darling stayed home with the children, while Mr. Darling went to work in stocks. His stocks didn't always work for him, however, and so the family had to scrimp and save. They still had a nanny, of course, because all other families in the neighborhood had one. And Mr. Darling cared very much about keeping up with the neighbors. But the Darlings were poor, and so their nanny was just a giant Newfoundland dog named Nana. Nana was an interesting nanny, to say the least. She didn't believe in all of the newfangled talk about germs. Sometimes she would lovingly lick the children right after she licked her own foot. Ugh. Mr. Darling was ashamed or embarrassed of Nana, and sometimes he was cold to her as a result. He shouldn't have been. She was actually quite a treasure. If the children wandered or dilly-dallied on their way to school, she would bump them right with her big head and get them back on track. She never once forgot John's soccer uniform, and she usually carried an umbrella in her mouth instead of a bone in case of rain. And it did rain quite often in England. All in all, the Darlings were a normal, happy English family, until, that is, the arrival of a boy named Peter Pan. Mrs. Darling had never heard of Peter Pan until one day she was tidying up her children's mind. Most good mothers do this after the children are asleep, as if their minds are drawers and the children's memories are underwears and socks that need to be neatly folded and put away. Oh, how Mrs. Darling would wrinkle her forehead sometimes at the sweet things she found in her children's mind, wondering where on earth they had picked them up. These things she would lay out lovingly, smooth on the bed for the children to slip on first thing in the morning. Other times, however, she found mean or ugly thoughts in her children's sleepy heads. These she would shake out quickly and hide, like something pushed under the bed. Children's minds are like curious places. If someone could draw a map, it would be full of zigzag lines and squiggles. Eventually, however, all the lines and squiggles would lead to Neverland. So at this time, I want you to close your eyes, and I'm going to be describing Neverland. Really dig deep and think about every word I'm saying and picture it in your mind. What is Neverland, you ask? It is the magical island in the middle of every child's mind. It is the place children go to mainly in their imaginations, unless, of course, they have an invitation and a very special guide. Every child's Neverland is slightly different. Some are in color, and others are in black and white. Some have ragged coral reefs with tiny smashed up boats, lonely caves, and tiny huts on a beach. Others have hunchbacked little old ladies, turtle-laying eggs, or gnomes who like to sew. Others still have scary first days of school, trying not to laugh at church, pop quizzes on grammar that you haven't studied for, money from the tooth fairy, and chocolate pudding. There are no rules to what one's Neverland should be. John's Neverland had a lagoon with flamingos flying over it, while Michael, who tried to be hard like his brother, had flamingos with lagoons flying over it. Wendy, meanwhile, had a pet wolf and a boat. The island doesn't appear on any map because it never stands still. If you can find it, Neverland is a very fun place to visit during the day when it's sunny. But in the 2 minutes before children go to bed, it becomes scary and full of shadows. That is why nightlights were invented. You may open your eyes, and we will continue. Mrs. Darling didn't know anything about Neverland, or rather, she did from her own childhood. But she had long since forgotten and was so confused when she bumped into the island in her travels through children's minds. There were other things that confused her too. For starters, there was the name Peter, which came up again and again in bold letters than any other word in all of her children's mind, especially Wendy's. "Who is this Peter?" she asked her daughter. "Is he a friend of yours?" "Well," Wendy admitted, "not always." "You know I don't like you talking to strangers," Mrs. Darling said. "But he isn't a stranger, Mother. Don't you remember him?" "Why, I've never heard of him in my life," Mrs. Darling insisted. But as soon as she said this, she knew it was not quite true. She could not remember meeting Peter or even knowing him. No, she was too old for that. But in the back of her mind, she recalled a story about a boy who kept children company so that she had believed in him when she was Wendy's age. "Well, anyways, if I do remember him by now, he would be grown up just like me," she said, and tucked Wendy in for the night. "I'm worried about this Peter person," Mrs. Darling told her husband later that evening. "Ugh, don't be," he said. "It's probably just some nonsense put into their head by that no-good nanny. It will all blow over. Wait and see." These are what sometimes referred as to the famous last words. And that is the end of Chapter 1. Thank you so much for listening and following along. So here's some questions to think about, and you are going to answer them at the very end of watching this video. What questions do you have about this chapter? Maybe I can answer them. Did you notice anything strange in this chapter? Besides my accents. What do you think is going to happen next, and why? Other questions that we're going to be talking about in just a few seconds. What do you know after reading this chapter? Who are the characters introduced so far? Let's take a look at the characters in a family tree. So we have Mother, who is Mrs. Darling. We have the father, who is Mr. Darling. And they have 3 children. Their daughter Wendy, their son John, and their son Michael. It goes in order from oldest to youngest. Now we learned a lot about Mrs. Darling and Mr. Darling. When we learn a lot about a character, remember, we can identify their character trait, which is why I have the CTs at the bottom. We would call Mrs. Darling maternal. Maternal is another way to refer to someone who is motherly, takes care of the children, does all the cooking and cleaning for them. So we would say Mrs. Darling's character trait is maternal. Now let's take a look at Mr. Darling. I would call him insecure. Insecure is describing someone who is always thinking about other people and comparing themselves and fearful that they are different from everyone else, in which that's true about Mr. Darling. We see that he's ashamed or embarrassed of Nana, their nanny, because everyone else has an actual person as a nanny, and he's the only one who doesn't. And he's embarrassed by that. Not to mention, it tells us in the story that this family, the Darling family, are poor, and they have to work 10 times harder to keep up and have the same things as other people because Mr. Darling wants that. Now, I left character traits blank for Wendy, John, and Michael because they were only introduced. We don't know enough about what they did and said to give them a character trait. But there is one more character that I did not talk about, and that is their dog or nanny, Nana. Nana definitely has a character trait, and I'm going to ask you to tell me what Nana's character trait is. But before we do that, let's take a look at the illustration, because remember, our first target was finding or looking at the illustration and how it contributes to the text. So let's take a look here. What is it showing? Well, it shows Nana, the dog, the nanny. How does this illustration contribute to the text? Does it help us better understand mood, character, or setting? So when you look at this picture, does this picture tell you the mood or the feeling? Does it show a character? Or does it show a setting? You are going to answer that question after watching this video. So again, what is this picture showing? Well, we said it's Nana, but think about what Nana is doing here. When you think about what Nana is doing, that will help you or guide you to figure out the character trait. If you need to go back to the video and listen again about Nana when you see this illustration, you absolutely can. So as we're winding down, wrapping up our mini lesson, what did this chapter make you think about? Did you like this chapter or did you not? Why? Let's review really quick and recap about Chapter 1. So the title was Famous Last Words. Well, what happens? We're introduced to the Darling family and their dog, Nurse or Nanny, Nana. We also learn about Neverland and Peter through the things that Wendy and Mrs. Darling tells. And we also see that Mrs. Darling is worried about this Peter person. How does it build or it gives us information so far? Well, this is just the first chapter. So really, in the first chapter of a story, it introduces the character, the setting, which is in England, and a little bit of the character traits. Let's review our learning target. I can explain how an illustration or a drawing contributes or adds to the text. I can recount or retell Chapter 1 of Peter Pan. You're going to hit those targets by answering those questions we saw earlier right after you're done watching and clicking out of this video. So you're going to scroll down, answer all the questions, and don't forget to hit the submit button. There's a special announcement about how you can recount or retell Chapter 1. Looking forward to what you all have to say. Good luck.